My fascination with color began as a little girl, as far back as I can remember. I remember when I was a little girl, walking through the fields to my grandma's house. And I remember seeing color, and I remember seeing pinks in the seed pods and purples in the skies, and wondering how I would paint that. This fascination has just grown throughout my whole life and has never stopped. When I started teaching over 20 years ago, I was perplexed by the fact that I couldn't get people to understand how to see the relativity of color. My fascination with color began when I was a little girl, and I remember walking through the fields to my grandma's house and seeing pinks in the seed pods and purple in the sky. It's so vivid to me, the memory. And I remember even before I ever painted, wondering how I would paint that. This fascination that I had with color when I was little, it only has developed and grown into my life's work. My earliest experience and memory of consciously thinking about color is walking through the fields to my grandmother's house. And I remember so vividly seeing pinks vibrating in the seed pods and purples vibrating in the sky. And I remember stopping and just wondering how I would paint that. That's just never stopped for me, that fascination, that wonder, that curiosity. And that is the main driving force for everything that I do with teaching and painting. It's just so driven by curiosity and wonder. I mean, I just love the immersion of studying color. And for me, teaching that is like my life's greatest passion. And exploring the world of color and the illusion of light with paint.
That's a color theory. What prompted you to do that?
I wrote my book, Painting Color Relativity, because my students encouraged me to do so. And this 10-year process, birthing experience of writing the manuscript has morphed into the creation of a nearly 200-page manuscript on painting the relativity of color. My students they are the reason that this process that I created to teach and strategize color theory and relativity even exist. It was out of absolute, complete desperation of trying to explain to my students what was going on in my head. I wrote a book. My students are the reason that I wrote this book. The encouragement from my students, the enthusiasm, the excitement about learning color and actually having a system, a strategy, an approach to creating the illusion of light through color relativity. And it was really through desperation of me trying to explain to my students what was going on in my head before I even hit the canvas with paint. And I thought, I don't know how do I teach them? How do I get them to go into my head, in my brain, and understand what I'm seeing and what the strategizing is that goes on before I even hit the canvas. I came up with this approach that is just different than anything I had ever seen. And I saw my students' work changing and coming to life, and it was like light and form and vibration was coming off the canvas. And if that doesn't excite someone, I don't know what would. I mean, for me, as their teacher and as a painter, I was just really fascinated by what I was seeing and why I was seeing what I was seeing. What I did was I learned that, I'm not really inventing the wheel here. I'm just going about it another way. And the end result maybe is the same as great masters in the past. I just needed a systematic approach, a strategy for painters to be able to study, see, and articulate what they're seeing with their eyes, going into their brain, and then how to get it on the canvas. I think of painting like playing the piano. If you think about a pianist making beautiful music through pressing keys on a keyboard, and there's music. There's one note against another, okay? So it's that combination. But the pianist, when they were studying, they had to know where the keys were on the piano before they could make beautiful music. And it's the same thing with painting. It's not simply grabbing paint, the act of smearing paint around a canvas, that makes it a beautiful painting. There is foundation and there is fundamentals that are the building blocks and the strengthening core of creating representational painting. And what I learned is that painters need foundation. They need to understand the fundamentals. They need to know it inside and out, the tools of creating a representational painting. And without that, they're just banging on the keys and it's noise. It's not necessarily music. And they want that, we desire to understand, to use both sides of our brain, not just one side. Humans are thinking, feeling beings, and if we're only feeling, there's no foundation to support that feeling. And if we're only academic and with formula or foundation, there's no art. And painting and art is a dance between passion and intellect. And so it's a constant balancing act. What I've learned is missing for most people learning to paint or trying to improve their craft to painting is a real foundation, real tools that they can learn, like on the piano, learning where the keys are before they make beautiful music. The emphasis on this book is understanding what you're seeing, teaching you how to see the truth, and providing a step-by-step strategy of how to create the illusion of light by understanding the relativity of paint. And color is relative, and what that means is color is influenced by everything surrounding it. It's influenced by the light, and it's influenced certainly by other colors next to it. So the relativity of one color compared to another is an illusion, and there are different properties in understanding that and breaking that down. Its own, color can never be isolated on its own. It's always influenced and affected by surrounding colors. So what we're doing is think about this as you're painting an illusion, because everything that we see is an illusion, including shadows. So when we think about what we're seeing and that we're creating on a 2D surface with paint the illusion of light and form, using color, one color against another, the juxtaposition of one color against another, to translate into the brain of the viewer an illusion of light and form. What we're doing, essentially, is we're moving our eyes around from one color shape to another color shape in our scene.
Yeah.
I break color down into primaries, secondaries, and tertiaries. A primary color is yellow, red, or blue. A secondary color is any color created from two primaries. We've got orange, we've got green, and we've got purple. And then everything else is tertiary. And essentially, everything that I see in nature is tertiary. So I was finding that my students could really understand, and they could articulate, and they could tell me that that's green, or that's orange, or that's purple. And then when it came to mixing the tertiaries, I found that their color was quickly turning into mud. And that was a problem, because in their initial blocking in and maybe not getting the refinement of the tertiaries, they had really beautiful, clean color. But it was a little bit garish because it was missing the graying or the neutralizing factor of the tertiary. So one day, I came into the studio and I said, okay, we are going to use simply yellow, red, and blue, and white. I want you to get rid of all other colors. And then what I want you to do is I want you to break down the shapes, and I want you to determine their secondaries. Although, yes, they are indeed tertiary, I want you to omit the tertiary from the scene, forcing my students to choose the relativity. So, for instance, if a shadow looked purplish-greenish, it can't be purplish-greenish. Is it more purple than the surrounding color, or is it more green than the surrounding color? And they might say it's both, but when they moved their eye back and forth, they had to choose if it was more of a purplish or a greenish. And I started working with them and having them omit the tertiary in the beginning block-in stages of the painting. And what I saw was absolutely mind-blowing, amazing. Their work was coming alive with light and color and vibration. And it reminded me exactly of what I saw when I was a little girl walking in the fields, vibrations of pinks and purples. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is real, this is truth, and this is reality. So I saw this working for an entire semester, and we worked on this for an entire semester. And I'm telling you, the carrying power of the paintings from across the room was mind-blowing. And so I thought, uh-oh, so can this actually work? Can I do a finished painting like this? So I put this to the test. And in my book, which this was like almost 10 years ago now, in my book is the step-by-step, week-long process of a demonstration that I did, locked myself in the studio, and I put this to the test. I used 3 colors plus white. I set up random images I set up random still life objects, oranges, a porcelain vase, a basin, just different color things. And I started breaking down the difference between each light and each shadow and each shape of color. And I chose the secondary for each one. I did the block-in, and in my book, there is a demonstration of this exact exercise. This is the birth and the beginning of this book. And I went all the way through to the end, and I worked in the halftones and the cores and the reflected light and the tertiaries. And the painting sold the next day without me even having any plan to do so when clients came up to buy and pick up a landscape painting. And what they said to me is they don't even like still life. They don't know why they love this painting so much, but they had to have it.
So just out of curiosity, this is a little side. There's a term autodidact, which means, are you self-taught, or how did you acquire your expertise?
Okay. Something that's always fascinated me is that painters observe and see the truth. And I remember when I first started teaching, I remember an older, wiser woman telling me that you can't teach anyone how to paint, but you can teach them how to see. And at that younger age, I thought, well, that's ridiculous because I teach people to paint every day. And now I understand the truth to that. I often refer to Leonardo Da Vinci And it's pretty interesting to me how much of his discoveries were from simple observation of truth. And my fascination with him has a lot to do with his discovery of shadow and its telling of form. And throughout my book, I refer to Da Vinci in almost every chapter. What I'm doing really is teaching people how to see the truth. And I'm providing them a strategy to articulate that truth. My emphasis is on color. Breaking down a strategy and a method and a foundation, the properties of color, hue, value, temperature, saturation, and branching into the difference of saturation and chroma. I remember the first time that I really authentically and truly saw and understood temperature of light. I was driving with a painting friend, and he said, "Look at how warm the light is tonight. It's so red." And I remember looking across the road and seeing just exploding red particles floating in the air as it seemed to my eyes. And that really told me a lot. I don't know that I would have seen that night if he wouldn't have said, "Look at the warm red light." And that tells me so much about the importance of learning and being educated on anything that has to do with color, paired with seeing. So I just don't know. And I think of Da Vinci and his discoveries and his scale and proportion and shadow tells form and his discovery and observations of light and three-dimensional form on a 2D surface. And I think, what would we know to be true if someone didn't teach us? And that is what I'm doing in my book. I am just showing you how to see the truth of what we see so that you can see it and understand it. Because if we don't know what to see and how to see it, how do we see it? Temperature to me is one of the most important properties of understanding and painting color and achieving luminous light on your canvas. Temperature is relative, and of course it is. It's a property of color. But color temperature is relative just like the other properties of color. There is not a warm and a cool color, or a warm or a cool color. There is a warmer and a cooler. There's no such thing as a warm or a cool color. It's all relative, just like the other properties of color. It's warmer or cooler. If we think about the primary colors, yellow is the warmest, and then red, and then blue. If we think that red is warm, well, that's an emotional response. We have to have something to hang our hat on when we're painting. We can't just feel our way through this. We have to understand that there is indeed a warmer and a cooler relationship between each color. Red, you may emotionally feel is hot, and that can be employed later on in your painting as an emotional response. When we're teaching, we have to have something to teach. In order of warmest to coolest in the primaries is yellow, red, and then blue. Red is warmer than blue, and red is cooler than yellow, making color relative. The title of my book is Painting Color Relativity. At this point, this book is the result of my life's work. Painting is a language, and a language requires terminology and definitions so that the painter can articulate through paint their expression of the language. Painting is language, and a language requires terminology and definition so that we can articulate our voice through our medium. And in this book, we're talking about the communication with paint. What's unique about the layout and the format of my book is that I begin the book with definitions. I call it key terms. And the key terms you're going to jump right into before you do anything else in the book. And you're going to mingle and become familiar with the language of paint. So often people come to me and they say that their paintings are anemic or pasty or chalky, and they know why. And they tell me it's because they use white. And they say, I know, I shouldn't use white. That is just simply not true. We cannot paint beautiful, luminous color in the illusion of light without the use of white. So white is not the problem. White is just revealing the truth of your color. White reveals the color. And in my book, I have an entire chapter on the important properties and how to use white, including 2 pages of exercises and how you can learn to gradate and control the saturation, the temperature, the value, and the chroma, simply by knowing how to use white and how it integrates with your color. Gray, like the old saying goes, it's not black and white, it's gray. When I tried to find the definition of gray, it was impossible because it's gray. So for a painter, the definition of gray is tertiary, and it's everything between point A and point B and everything in between. There are countless nuances in color, and I mean infinite. Gray is a tertiary, ultimately. So what I have people do when they first come to me is I ask them what color palette they use. Oftentimes they tell me that they use a white palette. I see that as a problem. And the first thing that I have people do when they come to study color with me is I have them create an actual palette, a working surface, in a halftone gray color. This improves their paint color immediately. The reason being is that halftone gray, number 5 on a value scale, is a value that is right in the middle between the separation of light and dark. So it helps them to not be working on an extreme value, which would be white. If you work on a white palette, everything next to it looks a lot darker than it is, and may be the reason that your paintings appear chalky.
I like grays.
We love gray. Gray is infinite, and we need to know how to use them.
Say that again.
Gray is infinite.
How about we love gray?
We love gray. And gray is infinite. We just need to know how to manipulate it. One note of color next to another.
A chapter or?
One of the most useful chapters in my book is the chapter where I share an exercise that I have the reader go through a sequence of asking themselves a question. Is the color that I'm seeing lighter or darker, or cooler or warmer than the color next to it? These will show this. One of the most beneficial chapters in my book is the chapter where I introduce making grays with the primaries of yellow, red, and blue. And you're asked to identify the temperature relationship and the value relationship of each swatch of color. the number one key phrase that I use when I'm teaching, and that you'll see throughout this entire book, is lighter, darker, cooler, warmer. In fact, many of my students throughout the years have said, you're going to have a book, and it's going to be, the title is going to be lighter, darker, cooler, warmer. Well, I have a book, but the title is not lighter, darker, cooler, warmer. It's Painting the Relativity of Color. But it is a main chapter in my book, and it is a key phrase. In fact, I call it a mantra. Is the color lighter or darker than the color next to it? And is the color cooler or warmer than the color next to it? And by employing those words and asking yourself those questions, you can paint and problem solve any color without fear.
You know, you talked about years ago.
So years ago when my kids were little, it was a Sunday morning, and they were sitting at the kitchen table coloring, and I was watching them, and I was watching the sun hit their little heads, and I sat down with them with my cup of coffee, observing them, and I saw all these different temperatures in the color of the light and the shadow of their hair. And suddenly I had an idea, because at the time what was happening is I was conflicted, and I had an issue with explaining to my students how to see and how to paint and articulate, break down color temperature. So I go and I grab my easel and my palette, and I squirt out yellow, red, blue, hefty amounts, and white. And I start making different temperatures of gray, just using yellow, red, and blue. All the same saturations, all the same values, but different temperatures. And I don't know how my kids or why they allowed me to work all day without bothering mom, but they did. And I think it was like 8 hours later, I had 6 charts. And I brought the charts into my studio the next day, and I told my students to grab out yellow, red, and blue, and white, and we're going to try an exercise. And through this exercise, I trained them to see warmer and cooler colors, employing the fact that they know yellow is warmest compared to red and blue is the coolest, and red is warmer than blue and cooler than yellow. White, what the properties of white does, and I had them mix and match all the colors and match perfectly. This exact exercise that was born the morning that my 2 young children were coloring is the key exercise in this book for teaching you how to see and strategize and make any color temperature that you see.
Draw first.
There's a saying in the painting world that goes something like this. You can't paint yourself out of a drawing problem. And as much as we would like to believe that is not true, it's just so true. So every shape of color that we see is contained by either a line or an invisible line. Every shape is a drawing. You may mass and just vigorously mass in your shapes with big swatches, but wherever that shape ends is an invisible line that contains the shape. So the book begins with the properties of drawing, scale, proportion, angles, and a measuring recipe on how to break and measure these shapes apart.
Excellent. I was hoping you were going to get to that about being.
I never in my wildest dreams could ever imagine or think that I would be writing a book on primarily studying color from the still life. After all, I am pretty much a landscape painter. My passion is to be outside. I love immersing myself in the landscape. And yet, the value of studying from still life in a controlled setting will help all of your work, especially your observation and study of color.
Very good.
I never in my wildest dreams thought that I would be writing a book on studying color using the still life in a controlled setting to do so. After all, I'm a landscape painter primarily. The reason that it is so important and vital for the study of color using the still life is that you're in a controlled setting. And did I already say this?
Yeah, you did. That's what you were saying about,
The plein air?
yeah.
Okay. What the heck?
I'm listening more carefully than you.
What the heck? Well, good, because I'm... Okay.
Track shapes in plein air.
So in the book, once we go through the exercises of color and we go through studying color in the still life, I then show the reader how to apply these same basic concepts and principles to abstracting the color shapes of relativity in plein air, outside. Okay. An extreme light effect, as I define it, is a light effect that happens either fleeting, it breaks all the rules, or it happens when you least expect it. This happens when I happen to be standing outside already, studying in natural light, in the elements. I have a chapter in the book on how to handle those situations and explanations of the best way to attack those.
Making time to video.
Mm-hmm. People often ask me how I find my inspiration to paint, or how do I stay so prolific? That's a common question I receive. And, my answer is always this. I am not inspired to paint. Painting inspires me. And how I've done that is I show up every day. I treat this like a job, and the inspiration and the muse shows up for me once I show up as well. In the book, I found it was really important to me to break down my process of how I make this happen and how I created and designed this life as a painter and to succeed in it. My number one goal in painting is not to be successful, but to okay, so we'll stop at that for a second. My number one goal in painting is to continue to grow as a painter. And almost everything that I do, I ask myself, is this going to be good for me in my growth as a painter? Teaching has really been great for me for my growth, and it pushes me, and it keeps me thinking and pressing forward and engaged, and it nourishes me. I have an entire chapter dedicated to helping the reader structure their goals to continue to grow as a painter. I think the number one thing in setting goals is to realize that it's never about the destination, but it's about the journey and the process. And the reason goals are so valuable is that it helps the process and the journey feel better when we're succeeding and growing, and we feel and we can see that we are indeed continuing to have growth and development.
Okay, that's good, but I think you can tighten it up.
We're never going to find the time. The time is never going to just drop in our laps. We have to make the time. So I have an entire chapter devoted to steps and tips for you to create and craft and make the time to paint.
That's good. That's good. So I'm a student, what do you hope I get out of this book? How is this going to change me? How is this going to enhance my skills? What's it going to
The
do
whole
in my
book?
life?
The whole book?
Yeah, the book. Yeah.
My hope for everyone that reads this book is that it'll give you the confidence to make any color you see and create the illusion of light and form on your canvas without fear.
Okay, me.
Color gets all the glory, but value does the work. In the beginning of the book, I talk about the importance of value to your color. How I teach color and value is that value is not separate than color, it's part of it. To improve your color, you have to improve your value and have a clear understanding of how it works to create light and dark.
As you can see here.
Yeah. As you can see here, I am showing a full color painting in black and white so that it's only in values to show the importance of the value structure to creating the light effect. By creating your own value scale, you can develop an understanding of how manipulating a 1 to 9 value scale to create the illusion of light can strengthen your paintings.
And we show that.
Leonardo Da Vinci said, "The beginnings and ends of shadow lie between the light and darkness and may be infinitely diminished and infinitely increased. Shadow is the means by which bodies display their form. The forms of bodies could not be understood in detail but for shadow."
When you're talking about that. Or we could show you.
Or we could show light and shadow.
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah,
Or we
something
could-
like that,
we could flash
yeah.
a picture of him on there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Understanding where the line that separate, here, let me just do this.
Yeah.
I'll say depicting light and shadows. Depicting light and shadow is one of the most basic principles of painting. In my book, I dedicate an entire chapter to understanding the basic properties and principles that create a light effect through light and shadow.
Good.
Okay, so one of the most confusing elements in creating a light effect and establishing form is the halftone. And the reason that people are so confused by it is that there are two totally different definitions for halftone. I break these down and define them so that you will have no confusion about the two different types of halftone. And you really need to know what that is in order to create form and the illusion of light.
Beautiful.
Boom.
Beautiful.
I don't need to tell them what. If you're ever confused whether an area that you're painting is in light or shadow, cast a shadow on your object. You can't cast a shadow on a shadow. That's probably all they need.
To emphasize, you could say that so we get a little more body.
Yeah. Yep, okay.
Such and such. It's a simple point, but yeah.
In chapter 4, I break down all the elements of creating form. Every time there's a plane change, there's a color change. The properties of color are hue, value, temperature, and saturation. I really think that going back to the basics of just learning the basic properties of color, no matter how advanced you are as a painter, is probably
Whatever.
the properties of color as I define them are hue, value, temperature, and saturation. In chapter 5, I break down the basic properties of color based on the limited palette of yellow, red, and blue. After we learn the basic palette of the yellow, red, and blue, we go into an expanded limited palette, which is a warm and a cool of each of the primary colors. So you're going to have 2 yellows, 2 reds, and 2 blues plus white. I really am a believer that if you want to strengthen your work no matter what your level, go back to the basic primary palette.
See right there, you just...
Yeah, that. Here's a demonstration of gradating the secondary colors. Yellow gradating into blue, yellow gradating into red, and red gradating into blue.
That's good. Start over again. That's good. You're doing good.
Okay. The color triangle you see here of the yellow, red, and blue primaries teaches the painter to see warmer to cooler in a gradation triangle.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, explain.
Here I created what I call a saturation wheel. In the center, you see yellow, red, and blue, which are the 3 primaries. The yellow and the blue mingle, creating a range and a gradation of green. The blue and the red mingle, creating a gradation of purple. The yellow and the red mingle, creating a gradation of orange. As the colors radiate out and integrate with white in gradation, the colors become less saturated. As the colors move in, they become more saturated.
Okay. That's...
I think that the meat and the bones of this book are the exercises separating lights and darks and massing in your color temperatures by eliminating the tertiary. And then we can show. Using the primary limited palette to see and paint color relativity, we'll be eliminating the tertiary. I set up 3 green vessels. First I draw and I separate the separate. First I draw, and then I show the separation of lights from darks. This is how I see before I even begin to paint, clearly separating lights and darks as shapes. I strategize, finding the secondaries of each average compared to the other. I write my letter codes on the canvas itself. This creates the illusion of light through color relativity. In this exercise, I break down the steps and show you how to determine the predominant primary in each average and the secondary primary in each average. Then I merge the two, asking myself as I dart my eye back and forth, is the color that I'm mixing lighter or darker, and is the color that I'm mixing cooler or warmer? And I begin massing my averages in.
Because?
I think I love landscape painting simply because it's where I want to be. In the elements, studying light, studying color, immersed in nature.
Very good. Talk about that.
My constant quest for beauty and portraying the natural world through paint keeps me inspired and curious. I just love beauty, and I see it, and I especially see it in the natural elements, painting the landscape outside.
I think that's good.
When I'm painting outside, I look past detail. I don't see tree branches and leaves and grasses. I see abstraction of shapes, and I pull.
We can show that.
And I pull the shapes. I abstract them from the landscape as shapes of color to create this illusion of beauty.
Okay, that's really good. I want you to say it again.
Detail.
Excuse me. Okay.
Okay. When I'm outside studying in the natural elements, I do not see detail. I do not see grass blades and seed pods and branches and needles on the pines. I see large abstract shapes. The word abstract means pull from. So I'm pulling the truth of the elements, of the shapes, of color to create and capture the beauty that I see in the landscape. Abstracting from.
That's one of your best quotes yet.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's throughout the country. The paintings come from my color studies or my plein air work. So my plein air work and my color studies, and I use the words interchangeably because plein air work to me really is essentially studying color. And my studio pieces that later went on to exhibit in museums are inspired by and informed by my plein air paintings or my color studies.
So,
Our paintings. This might be actually a better way of saying it.
good.
So, my plein air paintings, I don't think of them as polished, finished paintings. I'm outside studying in plein air, in open air, to study firsthand the color and the light. I use the words plein air and color studies interchangeably. That's because for me, being out in the elements is not about making a product, it's about studying the color firsthand. I abstract the shapes, I gather the information, and I leave it alone. In my studio works that later sometimes end up in museums are informed and inspired by my plein air and my color studies. My plein air paintings are information and inspiration for my larger studio pieces. Okay.
Well done. That was well done.
Okay. This is getting bad. Okay. To pre-order my book, visit CamiMendlik.com and register for my email newsletter. Thank you so much.